So, the next major RTS real-time strategy for the uninitiated will fail. This is why. Some incredible clickbait from GiantGrantGames, though, like many in the RTS community, I seriously doubt it's actually clickbait, but just instead something to get you to watch a thoughtful discussion. I'm going to watch it. I'm going to react. I'm not going to be able to stop myself from hopefully pausing before I continue the video, but sometimes talking over. I'm not even going to address the topic until I see what we're looking at here. But GiantGrantGames, for those who don't know, is essentially the expert on the more single-player and campaign co-op side of things, at least as content creators go. And that is a perspective I don't really have as well, and a very important one when it comes to the future of RTS. So I do respect his opinion, even if I'm going to end up disagreeing with it, which I hope I will, but I fear I won't.
Players much prefer MOBAs, shooters, and Battle Royale. And developers will never invest in making one. There's no way to monetize it. No loot boxes or season passes. When a new title releases, it comes and goes with little fanfare. The player base dissipates in a few months, it can't sustain competitive ladder, and the game dies. RTS is a relic of gaming's past. As a content creator, I hear people say these things a lot when talking about the future of RTS, and honestly, I think they're full of it. People love to call doom and gloom. It's an easy alternative to critical thinking and analysis. People who remember the good old days of sitting on the gilded throne as the king of esports, declaring that all is lost and the world has left them behind. While I disagree on their diagnosis why, they are correct about one thing. New RTS releases have been consistently bombing. I'm going to argue that the core problem with RTS right now stems not from the players, but from the developers. There's been a fundamental design philosophy shift for RTS. Developers and publishers have lost vision on what makes these games so much fun to play. And if they don't change course, they are destined to a fate of mediocrity at best. They're targeting the wrong audience, not focusing on the correct content, and fundamentally misunderstanding who the average RTS player is. And if this doesn't get discussed, it will continue to happen again and again. But why am I qualified to talk about this? In addition to the basic facts,
I agree wholeheartedly with everything he said so far.
That I've played RTS for over 20 years now, have a career based around RTS, and run a large RTS community, I've also worked as an independent consultant for 2 currently unreleased smaller indie titles. This project work acted as the spark that inspired me to take up this project. Over the last few months, I've been surveying groups of RTS players, ranging from casual to hardcore, and I've received an absurd amount of feedback. The sample size of my data is currently 7,500 responses, an undeniably healthy dataset. Using this data, my experience as a player and as a creator, I'm going to explain why the developers keep missing the mark, what old developers used to do differently, and how they can fix it. But before that, even if a developer makes the perfect game, there has to be people interested in playing it. So how many people are playing RTS right now in March 2022? The answer is way more than you think. Getting user data for games can be pretty difficult, so I'm going to have to focus on what is currently the largest RTS, StarCraft 2. Together, we're going to walk through the steps to reach an approximation of the game's monthly average player base. Unfortunately, Blizzard really hates giving out data about their player counts, something about WoW's decline being very embarrassing for them to talk about. Thankfully, StarCraft 2 had someone who was the embodiment of passion, and while Blizzard wasn't willing to talk about their numbers, one man was. On November 1st, 2017, TotalBiscuit tweeted, "Oh, and by the way, we've seen the numbers. SC2 has a consistent 1.8 million to 2 million monthly user base the entire year. Co-op is extremely popular. Arcade has received a boost with the revamp, and there's a lot more coming." First of all, 2 million monthly users.
So, I was in the room when they told us this. And before this, they had us sign an NDA to not release this information, to which Total Biscuit said, "Here's a tweet." So, credit to him, which means it's out there now. And that is true. And everyone, which included content creators up from me all the way to Total Biscuit, I think the #1 RTS content creator maybe ever. Yeah. So, that is a lot of players every single month. And it is consistent. Especially since mutators were the big thing that made co-op very consistent. So, when he tweeted this, there was a collective community like, but then it was Total Biscuit, so nothing happened to him because what are you going to do? It's Total Biscuit. I hope at some point we have maybe someone like me or Grant has that kind of power, but there is a lot of that.
For a 7-year-old game is absurd. But that data is over 4 years old now. It's not going to be correct for today. But thankfully, we do have some nice numbers of ladder games played both in 2017 and now. We can use that data to extrapolate the average monthly player base for 2022. The 3 seasons for the year of 2017 averaged 150,000, 140,000, and 131,000 games played per day. This makes a yearly average of 140,000. For the full year of 2021, the average was 193.8 thousand, a 38.4% increase in number of ladder games played. This growth is almost certainly because the game went free to play in 2017 right after this tweet. Unless something incredibly unexpected is happening with the math here, that means that StarCraft 2's active player base is consistently and reliably over 2 million monthly active users. This is almost 12 years after the game's release and 2 years of being with bare minimum support. The reason that new RTSs are failing is not because of a lack of potential players.
I think of the 2 million active users, many of them are co-op and arcade players, who I do think that has dropped off somewhat significantly because they are a lot more dependent on a lack of new content than free-to-play multiplayer. But I wouldn't be surprised if the number's higher, but I would not estimate the same level of increase based on ladder games. I would just say this is anecdotal and I have no numbers. I would love for that to be true. I just am skeptical it's quite that much of a boost, but it's certainly not lower.
So the RTS audience exists, but who are they? This might come as a bit of a surprise, but even a decade after StarCraft 2's release, the large majority of players and viewers are casuals. In my survey data, over 3/4 of respondents self-identify as casual players, with under 20% being hardcore. This data lines up fairly well with a comment made by Matt Morris in an interview with Loco back in 2016.
Like most people come into these games are, Wings Heart, they play the campaign. We see about 80% of the people that love the campaign, and only 20% stick around for the hardcore multiplayer. I mean, these are the really hardcore, engaged, competitive players.
Is that like 80 to 20?
Yeah, it drops like that. So, for a long time we've been saying, how do we help these
I'm
people
off
stick
to the
around?
right
They
here
obviously
watching
love
this.
the game.
While my question divides between hardcore and casual, while Matt Morris talks about co-op and campaign versus ranked multiplayer, there is a strong correlation between these groups. It's not bold to assume that the majority of self-described hardcore players focus on competition and esports while casuals prefer everything else. Which brings us to error number 1 of most modern RTSs, focusing on competitive.
This brings us to error number 1, switches to AoE 4 gameplay. This transition is not lost on me, Grant.
Ladder and esports. With game releases like Grey Goo and Age of Empires 4, the focus was entirely on multiplayer. The campaign was an obvious afterthought. The AI was garbage, and at times it verged on unplayable. But this is alienating 80% of your audience. In my polls, I asked how important it was for a game to have various aspects for people to give it a try. On a scale of 1 to 5, 1 was not important at all, and 5 was essential. Here's the data for having a campaign, cooperative content, ranked 1v1, and an active esports scene. It's pretty.
I want to cast a little bit of context. I think he may do it as well. His channel is about doing the StarCraft campaign and co-op, and mostly campaign in very creative ways. So when you ask someone whose entire demographic is campaign and campaign viewers, this is the answer you're going to get. That being said, I don't think it's necessarily wrong, but once again, the proportions may be slightly off, and I do agree on this front.
Pretty obvious that the development focusing on creating a ranked multiplayer environment and pro play is not going to draw in the numbers. To double check these numbers, I went hunting through Steam achievements on various RTS games to see how many people are touching the multiplayer. I was shocked to see how low some of these numbers were. Iron Harvest sits at 19.4%, and it's the highest of the bunch. Company of Heroes 2 is 14.2%, Grey Goo 4.7%, and Ashes of the Singularity a measly 1.8%. Though that last one is probably because everybody who boots that game has their GPU melt. Unfortunately, as far as I can tell, there's no achievement data for Age of Empires 4, but I would be surprised if it were a significant outlier here. So if ranked multiplayer is not the most important thing to an RTS title for most players, why do developers keep focusing on it? It's pretty simple. Selection bias. Developers want to make the best product that they can, and very often bring on active and important members of RTS communities to help give those communities what they want. This is a great idea in theory. These people are very familiar with the scene in a way that developers can't be. But if you're a community member who makes their livelihood because of RTS, you aren't going to be a representative sample of the actual audience. Being a literal RTS professional, be it player or content creator, makes you the definition of hardcore. And yes, that absolutely includes me. Of course the hardcore of the hardcore are going to focus on 1v1. Even when they look at people who they see as less hardcore in their communities, they're so firmly integrated to the competitive community that they only see people with the same interests. I'm not saying it's wrong to create a game that caters solely to hardcore players, but developers should know that they are actively alienating a large portion of potential players by doing so. A tacked on afterthought of a campaign.
All right, I do want to personally talk about this. So I did a poll of about 5,000 or so, because when I was invited to the same community summit that Total Biscuit tweeted that NDA information from, I did essentially what Grant did here with my community. And that's why I'm mildly skeptic, because of course when I'm like, what mode should you focus on, it said mostly at least a split between co-op and ladder and very little campaign, because my audience is mostly ladder. Co-op's very popular, but obviously not much campaign. But there are definitely, especially in RTS, I will tell you that people were very focused on the casuals for years beforehand. Free-to-play was a discussion. Essentially people pushing free-to-play or some sort of entry-level RTS for years. Like, it's not that everyone was thinking that balancing the 1%, like how much attack damage should DTs do. That's not a discussion so much as what content should be accessible for free. As I think even 5 years ago, RTS is such a mature genre that people are thinking about that. So I think Grant, and through no fault of his own, doesn't realize, in my opinion, it's all on the developers and whoever's over the developers' heads, as there is plenty of feedback from a more casual perspective, even from very hardcore people like myself, and include, like, there aren't that many RTS people. Loco, Day9, Grant, myself, like, we're all thinking of the less, and maybe not completely casual players, but I do agree with the idea that a lot of people look at like Twitch numbers and esports, and they think that's everything, including developers. So, the opinions are definitely out there for people and professionals, including players. Like Harstem very much understands this as well. Is an example of a competitive player who tries to appeal to essentially the opposite audience. But yeah, I don't know how much of that gets through, and thus this video, though. I do agree with the broad strokes on it.
Pain isn't going to cut it. One more thing about audiences before we move on. There's a common misconception that the right RTS will grab all of the MOBA players and bring them back over from League or Dota. This idea stemmed from the fact that Defense of the Ancients started off as a custom game mode for Warcraft 3, and thus all early MOBA players were RTS players. But Warcraft 3 is almost 20 now. That doesn't apply to the modern MOBA player base. I polled about which genres RTS players tend to play, and MOBAs are behind RPGs, strategy games, FPSs, and sandbox games. If you feel like you need to bring in a different audience, you're better off catering towards Halo, Skyrim, and Kerbal Space Program players. Before we move on to the main points, I'm going to switch to Opinion Grant for a moment and talk about stuff. Given the niche I fill on YouTube and Twitch, I interact with a larger variety of casual and newcomers to the RTS genre than almost anybody else on Earth. My focus on campaign-based content makes me a natural springboard for people looking to get into the game. From this unique position, I've heard a lot of opinions and preconceptions about RTS and its players from more or less outside sources. And I think many of these are fairly problematic. StarCraft players in particular love to talk about how freaking hard the game is. How a ladder match is like playing chess and piano at the same time. How it's the most competitive 1 versus 1 game. How you physically can't click on the button to queue a Zerg unless your IQ is over 800. Basically, it's a lot of self-flattery, but it works. People see these views when they're looking into a game to play, and it's not a good thing. It makes people hesitant to try out the game. They're not sure they want to spend the time it takes to learn when the community makes it seem like you need a PhD to build a barracks. I think this is part of the reason that the casual to competitive conversion rate is so low. People are intimidated. My experience with both the StarCraft and Warcraft communities is that once you're inside, they're kind, supporting, and fairly non-toxic. But from an outside perspective, we look like a bunch of self-aggrandizing elitists.
That's
so no
'cause we
wonder
are.
developers are trying to market towards that angle. I think it would be healthy to admit that while professional
true.
play is absolutely cutthroat intense action all the way through,
Actually, let's just let it play through.
it's not that
Little.
way for 99% of players. If most people knew most ladder games were more like two drunk toddlers fencing with pool noodles, the intimidation factor would be significantly lower. So with all that out,
True, true. You know, that last part, very true. That is a good point. So, I agree and disagree on many of these points. I agree that the casual player coming by RTS will see all this. And that is why not so much it's intimidating to join, why it's important to have other aspects. I don't think making it seem more accessible for something like 1v1 is necessarily, like, it's not going to happen. In a 1v1 game, there's always going to be people stroking their ego, saying, in order to be good, like, and who's going to say otherwise? Like, there's stereotypes in team games, like, you play this role or do that or whatever. In 1v1, it's all you. It's always going to be an incredibly stressful experience, no matter what game you're playing. But I think that goes back to why it's so important to not cater to that audience. He's right on that point. I think there is not nearly enough, or there hasn't been nearly enough of advertising the other things. Like, so Blizzard was very hesitant. I'm going back to like the SC2 community summits, where essentially people like Total Biscuit and very much smaller myself talked about marketing. And I will say Total Biscuit, as well as many of the other content creators, agreed. With RTS, with StarCraft 2, the most competitive game. Eventually, you'll see it now. The most competitive 1v1 game. And it is. And that was seen as a draw. And I don't think trying to convince people it's not, and then them getting in and seeing, oh, I just get stomped because I'm not playing it seriously. Like, it requires a sort of commitment that your average player is not really willing to bring. But that's what makes the campaign and co-op and all the custom games and that part so important. So while I think, yes, it is intimidating and the community is like that, and I agree with the assessment entirely, I don't think there's any getting away from that. I think that does highlight the importance of having anything else or any other incentive for those of you that don't want to be more stressed out when you get home from work playing StarCraft or whatever RTS, as opposed to when you are actually stressing yourself out. So it's an interesting point to bring up. I don't think there is any reconciling that in a 1v1 game. It's always going to be incredibly stressful. I think leaning into it, but also offering alternative modes and ways to have fun with the game is the best way to do it. Having a casual audience that enjoys the game, and then having options for a competitive audience. And when you're going to be a 1v1 competitive game, it's always going to be hardcore people. They're always going to act like that. Literally, look at this post. I want to point out this post that he was showing. If you didn't
99%
notice
players.
something.
If most people knew casual into
Dun,
natural
dun, dun, dun.
not a good. It's not all that new
Maybe near
RTS
the
is
end.
in
I
the
don't
Blizzard
know.
Angle. With both the StarCraft and Warcraft communities is that once you're inside, they're kind, supporting. People are.
Where is it?
And it's not.
Yeah, let's go back. He kept the name of one of the players on this. It's a barcode with 5 posts. There's a barcode on the forums. There's no getting away with this. Like, there are barcodes who make Smurfs to trash talk on the forums. That is just SC2 players in a nutshell. And I've spent too long talking about this point. I agree. The perception is it is very hard to get into and probably not worth your time. So make it worth their time, developers. Make it so you get something other than a feeling of lower self-esteem when you lose. But also make it a competitive game. I'm coming at it from a different side of things. I don't think you need to cheapen the competitive nature to give more incentive to those who are less invested. But I agree with the general point, but I want to provide a different side of it. I know I'm doing this live, so I'm kind of formulating my thoughts live, which is how I do it, and that's why StarCraft 2 is so hard. Because okay, all right.
So with all that out of the way, let's get to the core of this. What did old RTS have that was so successful that new RTSs are not doing? It's worth stating that this is not a blanket truth. Many RTS have released in the past that have crashed and burned in ways that make recent releases look successful. Instead, we're going to look at the common themes from the 3 biggest success stories. These being the Age of Empires and Mythology series, Command & Conquer, and the Blizzard RTSs. There are 3 pillars that these franchises had that allowed them to rise above and beyond and dominate the market for almost a decade. They are the engine, spectacle, and development tools. To introduce the first pillar, I want to talk about the 2020 release Iron Harvest. This game is awesome. Post-World War I dieselpunk mechs is an incredibly cool and unique setting.
It
the
plays
units are
terrible,
stylized
though.
and varied, from tiny walkers with machine guns.
It feels like playing Molasses. I do agree that the setting is really cool, but oh my god. I, as the hardcore competitive player, found it intensely boring and clunky, but it does look cool, and the setting is very cool.
Guns to enormous monsters with siege cannons. The visuals are pretty solid, the campaign voice acting is fun, and it's consistently supported with DLC content. It's really astonishing how uninterested I am at playing any more of it. The game fundamentally fails in its most basic aspects, pathfinding and responsiveness. When a group of units is told to go to one place, they'll split up and head a variety of different directions, making controlling even mid-sized armies a chore. Units are clunky, particularly large units take ages before
these
they're able
clips
to
are
execute
sped up by
commands,
40%.
often creating frustrating situations where your most prized forces are sitting around like dunces while being killed. It relies heavily on a cover system for holding areas with infantry, but the outsides of most buildings can't actually be used for cover, with garrisoning being the only option. The enemy will select a unit of yours to kill, and if pulled back, the AI will charge their most expensive units through your entire army to reach it. I got
paid to play this game
too. I really do.
I really
but
tried.
I just can't. The game fundamentally feels bad to play. Many times when you lose, it's not because the enemy out-tacticked or overpowered you, it's because you're fighting a 2v1 against the opponent and the game's controls. It's worth stating that some games in the past feel like that. StarCraft 1 doesn't feel good to play these days, but it was an upgrade from previous titles like Age of Empires, and then Age of Empires 2 was an upgrade from StarCraft. Red Alert was an upgrade from both, and that repeats over and over, each
until
release being
StarCraft
slightly
2.
better than the rest, until StarCraft 2, where no other modern RTS has matched the pathing or the controls. RTS is a genre where you're going to have to spend significantly more time on the fundamentals. Gorgeous aesthetics mean nothing if the player is focusing all of their attention on trying to get the unit to move properly. Incredible sound design
This is
for
why
attacks
AoE
is
4 doesn't
worthless
work.
if units can't find their way to the battlefield. In games like shooters, the technical investment is far lower. Engines come with pre-provided tools and developers have a firm understanding of the genre by now. But RTS needs a little bit more care under the hood. For all you executives and project managers out there, it might seem difficult to justify spending all the extra time and money on getting these fundamentals correct. But I promise you that by the end of this video, you will understand that this is not a barrier to entry for the genre, but instead an investment into saving more time, effort, and money down the line. One thing I find incredibly fascinating about the Big Three is they managed to span all of the main settings of gaming. Age of Empires was historical, Command & Conquer was modern fantasy, Warcraft was high fantasy, and StarCraft was sci-fi. Despite the settings being so wildly different, each of these games do a great job with the second pillar, spectacle. Spectacle doesn't need much explanation. Cool things are cool, and using cool things is fun. Age of Empires allowed players to recreate history in a way that was completely novel at the time. Age mythology brought
like all the
literal
blood.
deities into the mix, dropping meteors and thunderstorms on your opponent before moving in with an army of minotaurs and chimera. Command & Conquer started fairly average, but it dialed up to 11 with the Red Alert series. Weather control, Tesla coil troopers, zeppelins, mind-controlling enemies to run them into a grinder to harvest them for resources? It's crazy! Warcraft hit all the fantasy notes. Pillaging your foes with orcs, ambushing as elves, powerful heroes that shape the battles around them, a huge, diverse selection of third-party creeps that can be both fought for rewards and hired as mercenaries. And finally, StarCraft's far-future Protoss facing against the hillbilly Terrans with janky explosives. And of course the Zerg rushes that are so iconic that they've become a basic part of gaming jargon.
Pretty sure it's
Spectacle
a real word
is what
now.
you put on the box art, on the Steam page. It's what draws people in, and then starts to get them thinking. When things are crazy and wild, the player gets excited to find new interactions and combos. Ways to rush towards their favorite unit, ways to make...
Since we keep overlapping opinions, I want to talk. I think he's going to talk about visual style and how you don't necessarily need to have great graphics to have a solid spectacle, making things visually distinctive without being cluttered. This is why Brood War is still pretty fun to watch. Age of Empires 2, StarCraft 2 especially. Because if you go too far to homogenizing the units and the look of things, or not differentiating them, then you get games like AoE 4, where you can see 14 different units that all look the same and die the same. And it doesn't, like, you don't have box art anymore, essentially. You no longer have that, except for set pieces. Like, I think plenty of great indie games have come out in the last many years that show you don't need to melt your GPU just to have a great looking and feeling game. And I think especially modern RTS, with AoE 4 being the defining example, is a case of not really thinking about what it'll look like when the players get a hold of it, as opposed to just like a cinematic or something.
Make it work, even if it's a little bit underpowered. As the design focus has shifted towards multiplayer first, a lot of spectacle has been cut. Decimating armies with an invulnerable Soviet tank line with the Iron Curtain just isn't fair in multiplayer. You can't have Yuri mind control enemies and grind them up for cash, it's too cost efficient. When the design is for multiplayer first, you inevitably cut the things that should be selling your product.
That's what co-op
A good
is
example
for.
of getting this balance right is StarCraft 2.
So we had all these ideas while developing StarCraft 2 that we thought were pretty cool. We had units like the Diamondback, which
Literally,
is this tank
co-op
that
is
can
just
move
everything
and
that
shoot
wasn't
at the
gonna
same
work.
time. Well, it turned out it stepped a lot on the Marauder. It stepped even a little bit on the Siege tank in terms of its role. These units were too similar. And it wasn't actually that easy to control. It was actually very difficult to manage what this thing was shooting at while you're moving it. This guy wasn't for esports. We had a Spectre. It's a new type of ghost. This guy's going to be cool. Oh, okay, well, now we got two ghosts. You're going to pick one. You're not going to use the other one. And we didn't really want to cut the ghost. It seemed kind of core to what StarCraft was all about.
Wow.
So not for esports, the poor Spectre. But these are all cool.
Goliath,
These are
no,
all
come back.
units that in any other game I've ever worked on, I absolutely would have put in. But since those other games weren't designed to be an esport, they made no sense for StarCraft. But we wanted them in the game. We felt like we've done the art. They're fun units to play with. Why should the consumer not have the opportunity to play with these? And so we tried to find places we could put these.
Though I would argue that they didn't go far enough. Originally, the Thor was going to be a unit so massive that it had to be built by SCVs on the field. Battlecruisers
That's a
were
cool
going to
idea.
have custom weapon attachments like plasma torpedoes that had to be individually
Oh, that looks
upgraded.
amazing.
The mothership could stop time, crack planets, and create insta-kill black holes.
I mean,
the fact
they
that
kind
we
of
never
did
got
that.
to play with these is honestly disappointing. I'm not saying that competitive multiplayer should be filled to the brim with broken game-ending super weapons, but I feel like each faction should be designed with absurdity in mind. Make it ridiculous for the single-player experience, and then trim it down to what's fair for multiplayer. Boring, uninspired units and abilities are all too common in recent RTS. Cool stuff sells. At this point, you have a game with a strong fundamental base. You've designed bombastic, over-the-top units to energize and inspire the player base, but you don't get to make a game just yet. Now is the time to put effort into making a great editor. Not just a good editor, a great editor. This is the final pillar of successful RTS. The terrain,
This is why AoE 2 is still played today. This is why StarCraft 2, there are custom games in StarCraft 2 played more than some RTSs that came out in the last, since StarCraft 2. The StarCraft 2 engine is, the StarCraft 2 editor is probably the most powerful free custom editor in anything. Like, you can, like, Heroes of the Storm was built off the StarCraft 2 editor. I don't think the issues with Heroes of the Storm were off of the fact it wasn't a solid game to play, but instead design decisions and timing. But yeah, you can add custom assets and custom essentially everything, and it's built on the StarCraft 2 engine, which is the best RTS engine. And it took a whole lot of work to get there and a lot of investment that I think is going to be very hard to justify for a modern company.
Mission scripting, triggers, cutscenes, and even the AI should all be created inside of the modules of this editor. It is the Swiss Army knife that creates every piece of the game that the player interacts with. We all know the gaming scene has changed in the last 20 years. You can no longer get away with launching a product, a year later popping out an expansion, and calling it a day. Games as a service is the new normal. The new goal is the constant progressive creation and distribution of content in a game so that the players will continue to stick around. A powerful editor allows developers to create that content at a rapid pace. Take Age of Empires 2 for instance. The game initially launched with 5 campaigns, and as time went on, due to having a well-designed editor, campaigns have continued to be made and sold. As of writing this, the game has a staggering 33 available campaigns with almost 250 missions. This is an incredible amount of content to be pushing out, a constant way to reliably draw players back into the ecosystem, getting them hyped for the next content release. A powerful editor also gives the flexibility to capitalize on things that have accidentally become successful. StarCraft 2's co-op commander system was initially a tiny side project when it debuted in 2015. It was considered less important than Legacy of the Void's campaign, the mission packs, and of course the star of the show according to Blizzard, Archon mode. Well, it turned out Archon mode sucked and was a complete failure, but co-op was incredibly successful.
So, Archon mode sucked and was a complete failure because it allowed 2 players to play as a single player, which takes all the stress of playing 1v1 and adds the stress of playing with another person. It's not even like team games in 2v2 where you're both your own person. No, you have to learn to work with another person playing the most stressful game. So it adds the worst of both worlds. It was a very cool idea that completely bombed because no one in the target audience of hardcore RTS players wants to play with other people, because that's part of why they're hardcore RTS players. Great on paper, but in hindsight, makes a lot of sense. Like, if you ever are graced or disgraced with a relationship, you should play Archon mode with your significant other. Yeah. Good luck. If you survive that.
Successful.
Once.
And Blizzard was able to rapidly expand on it, turning it from a selection of 6 heroes to the current 18, as well as adding in a mutator and prestige system for massive levels of replayability off of a very small development team. If the editor they were working with was not as robust, flexible, and easy to use, that opportunity would have left them by the wayside. But now I have to admit, I've been a bit misleading so far. I said that these 3 pillars provided the support that old school RTSs had that led them to greatness, and that modern releases failed because they didn't have them. But that's not exactly it. These pillars serve as the catalyst for the true reason. What is the most powerful force in all of gaming? The critical core of the genre that
It better not be some corny shit like the players or something, or the community, or grassroots. Memes. I'm gonna go with memes.
has been lost and must return for a successful game. Of course, I'm talking about player-generated content. ModDB is a website for modding games, with a focus on older titles. It's not as big as places like the Steam Workshop or Nexus Mods, but
This
it's
entire,
been around
like,
for a while.
I would say
Slightly
Mod
more
Tools
recent
is
games
used
like Minecraft have 2 million mod downloads there, while some of the bigger titles from the old days like Half-Life and GTA San Andreas have almost 9 million mod downloads. That is a lot, but it's also unsurprising. GTA and Half-Life are not just big brands, they're cultural juggernauts in gaming. What is surprising is that both of these are dwarfed by Medieval 2 Total War's 11 million downloads and Command & Conquer General's 13 million. But why? These are both good games, but neither are iconic pieces of gaming history. RTS is specifically well suited towards user-made content. The top-down perspective is significantly less restrictive on creative freedom than the first or third-person cameras. An RTS with a good editor serves as a blank canvas for an inspired creator to build what they want. And while the average creation might be pretty mundane, there have been multiple instances where entire genres have been spawned from these editors, like tower defense and MOBAs. The reason that the focus on custom content was dropped was largely due to emulation. Developers saw that StarCraft 2 launched with a pretty terrible custom games section and determined it wasn't an important part of their own RTS. But this wasn't an intentional act by Blizzard, it was the arcade not being ready in time. I would argue that the 2 years it took for a good system to play user-generated content with people was StarCraft's greatest flaw, and that copycats are not following success but have instead been repeating a mistake. In the early 2000s, RTS had a dominant position on the player-generated content scene. In 2010, with the launch of StarCraft 2, that dried up. It's not like that creativity and passion to build has disappeared. It just went somewhere else. Because 1 year later, in 2011, Minecraft launched. And if you ask anybody
Minecraft launched in
aged 12 to
2011?
22, they can firmly tell you that
I thought
while
it was. I
Minecraft
assumed it
fun
was
on
like
its own,
1990
the best
somehow.
part was the mods. There was an absurd selection of unique game modes that captivated not just audiences, but also viewers, launching countless careers of Minecraft YouTubers who explored, highlighted, and played through these. The players were given a powerful tool to create, and proceeded to do not only that, but also organically market those creations to both each other as well as the wider world, with minimal developer input. This has proven to work not only in Minecraft, but in other games as well. Skyrim is famous for its insane levels of modability, and it just so happens to be the best-selling RPG ever if you don't include Pokemon. The best-selling Halo game is Halo 3, which just so happened to be the one that includes the Forge, which was by far the best way to create and share custom games in a shooter at the time. Kerbal Space Program spent the majority of its life as a bare-bones spaceship simulator brought to life by the easy-to-use CCAN mod manager. And don't even get me started about Half-Life mods, where people created niche modes like Counter-Strike and whatever the heck Gary's mod is. And despite all of these high-profile hits, and Minecraft being the best-selling game of all time, none of them are the most successful game to follow this formula. Roblox is. I'm going to put aside the questionable ethics of the Roblox Corporation right now. People Make Games already did a great video on that topic. Instead, just focus on the numbers. Roblox is only a platform for users to create games, share them, and play each other's creations. Roblox has 200 million monthly active users. At the time I'm writing this, Roblox has the same number of players as the top 3 Steam games combined. This formula of making a solid basis for players to create custom content works. It was proven with Battle.net in StarCraft 1. It was reaffirmed with the custom games section of Warcraft 3. It was driven to ridiculous proportions with Minecraft. And then Roblox came and drove the point home. RTS is a great platform for making this content.
Memes.
This content is immensely popular. The RTS player base skews towards older gamers.
Yeah, that's
and right
about
now,
right. That
there's
one's
a
right.
large number of now older gamers who grew up with Minecraft.
Hey, we saw
The
a
map platform
screenshot
for
there.
making this
Let me see.
content. This content is immensely popular. The RTS player
Yep. Actually, a little more 25-34 and 35-44 for me. I'm assuming that's his.
player base skews towards older gamers, and right now
Maybe
there's
because he
a
does
large
custom
number
games
of
and
now
fun
older
stuff, and I only
gamers
do
who grew
hardcore
up with
RTS.
Minecraft. The math makes sense.
Numbers don't lie.
Throughout the entire history of RTS, the common theme between the dominant titles has been creator agency. There's a fundamental limit to what a development team can do for a game. They can only make so much content, and after release, they're stuck in maintenance mode, running around putting out fires and squashing bugs instead of developing new content. When the community is empowered, the creation process can continue. When things are created and promoted, they draw in more players. And when more players are drawn in, some of them will become creators. This is the feedback loop that is key for creating a successful title. When you log into an RTS that's destined to fail, you log into a campaign and a 1v1 ladder. But for the kings of the genre, it's not just these things.
Oh, warships.
It's a MOBA, a unit spawner, a tower defense,
Zerg
a
Wars,
hero arena, a
Squadron
Sims game.
TD,
It's a cat
Random
and mouse,
Based
Mario
Defender.
Party, and Risk.
I don't even know that
It's
one.
even this weird Toho anime thing that I absolutely know nothing about, but if I did, Marisa would be best girl, don't at me. It's an auto battler, a card game, a tug of war. It's Mafia,
Direct
Bejeweled,
Strike,
and a typing
Mafia,
game.
Nexus,
It's a
Word
freaking
Wars,
MMO shooter. It's a way to be
StarCraft
competitive
universe.
and a way to play with your friends.
These are all StarCraft
None of
2,
these
in
things
case it wasn't
were made
clear.
by the developers, but all of them were made possible because of the developer. The reason that the next RTS
I don't
will
know what
fail
this one is.
a fundamental misunderstanding of what the S in RTS stands for. The first developer who understands that the S is not strategy, but instead stands for sandbox, will be the new king of the playground.
Oh, okay.
Thanks for watching. If you want to see for yourself some of the amazing work of the StarCraft 2 modding community, check out my daily uploads channel, GiantGrantGames Archives. I'm currently playing through Legacy of the Tal'Darim, a fun mod where you play through Legacy of the Void as a custom Tal'Darim faction, with both co-op units and a host of new awesome ones. I'm also starting the UED AI project, whose goal is to turn the brain-dead StarCraft 1 AI into an intelligent monster. And on Twitch for the next couple weekends, I'll be playing through the 7-player Wings of Liberty mod with random viewers. It's going to be
that
the
one's
most
a pain.
chaotic, best, worst
It's
thing I have
it's
ever
terrible. You have to restart the mission if you fail any part of it. The entire mission. Oh my god. Well,
played. If you're interested, I hope you can check it out. And either way, I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be here, and I hope the rest of your day is wonderful.
a little bit better. Well, thank you. So, summary. Yes, I agree with everything he said. And as I expected, the title wasn't so much a prophecy as clickbait to get you here and explain this. But, I mean, good clickbait, though. The correct. He's right. I have touched on this. I touched on this in my AoE 4 review. I'm just going to keep him in the background, but muted. Because I'm going to just have the background gameplay he's using there. And I'll talk. Yeah, he's right. Like, even now, we don't need that gameplay. That's not what gameplay looks like. But there's gameplay. He's right on every point, pretty much. This is one of my big things with AoE 4. The most, as you see there, the most recent, especially AAA RTS. Releasing without an editor, releasing essentially with a bare bones campaign and focused on multiplayer. It doesn't really hit any of those points. It doesn't feel that fun to play for hardcore players, and there's essentially nothing. There's campaign and nothing. They're releasing an editor soon, but I think it's a huge mistake not to have some form of an editor, especially nowadays. Like AoE 2, full of custom games. You go to the lobbies, you've got dozens of different, like Lord of the Rings, sort of. You've got Direct Strike equivalents, and then, of course, StarCraft Arcade. Is this why the next RTS will fail, though, is the question. I think it doesn't really address some of the key points. Like, his video doesn't really address some of the key points of modern gaming, which is monetization. Like, for a live service game, especially if you're going to make it free to play, how do you monetize that process? And user-generated content is notoriously hard to monetize, especially in a free-to-play game. Especially since some of those user-generated contents went on to become their own games. So, how do you solve that? Like, I'm not saying you can't make an incredibly popular game, but it's not the kind of game that people are playing every season or something like that. And I think that's the larger concern for developers, is not that developers don't want to make these things. It's that you're going to have a hard time justifying the investment in building a game editor for a free-to-play, like in building a game editor so people can play content for free. How do you monetize that part of it? As RTS has been notoriously kind of lacking in the microtransactions, the loot boxes, one way or another. No one's really modernized it. I think Immortal Gates of Pyre, the team at Sunspear Games, understands that. They have a lot of plans along those lines. We'll have to see how that plays out. Frost Giant is announcing something this year. That's what they've said. And they're looking at a spiritual successor to StarCraft, but how does that succeed in this day and age? And how do you get people to invest in it? And I don't know if this answers that question. I agree. It would be a very popular game. If you built a game that was StarCraft 2 plus, and it had an editor, and it had a competitive esports scene, and it had campaign and co-op content and all that. But it's just not the how do you say, this was the bring a game home in a box kind of era of gaming. Was StarCraft 2 is essentially the end of the bring a game home in a box and put it in your disk drive, or put multiple disks in your disk drive. Yes, I know, right? That's what we used to do back in the day. So I don't know. I agree that these are all the things that people love about RTS games and have historically loved. But I'm not sure how you sell it. Is my question. Like, how do you... And since I'm a lot closer to the esports side of things, to the... what actually does supporting a game look like side of things. Because these mods, because of these editors, the power of the StarCraft 2 editor, the AoE 2 editor, they built it, and people are still playing the game. But the thing is, for StarCraft 2, how much money are you making off someone who's playing free-to-play arcade? Simple answer is none. So, there is no incentive to be releasing more content for something... Like, co-op commanders are definitely something that people would pay for. And so where does this come to? I very much agree that user-generated content is necessary for a long-term RTS. But I think modern games maintain interest with, like, a seasonal system. Like, I've been playing Destiny 2, which has its seasonal items and events and activities, and I don't see why stuff like that can't translate to RTS. This brings it back around. What if, I'm going to use SC2 as an example, what if in the season of the season of the Purifier, I'm going to use Destiny 2, with the newest expansion, which is well received because I've been playing it and I didn't play the other ones, which apparently weren't as good. In the season of the Purifier, the content creators or whoever made the top 3 game modes for Purifier-based campaign content, maybe a third-person sort of role-player thing like we saw in there, maybe a co-op mission, and maybe a multiplayer map or campaign mission. Well, those are the 3 promoted things. You pay $10, you get access to these 3 things, some badges, some emblems, some loot box, bullshit, whatever. And I think there is a way for developers to integrate custom game creators, and that also incentivizes people to make better stuff and to get people to play it. I do agree that games like AoE 4 have not even pretended this has been a focus. So I think there is a way to monetize the best parts of RTS in a modern way without sacrificing any development on the engine or competitive multiplayer. But at the same time, as was kind of touched on in this part of the video, it's a large investment compared to just slapping something together. And this is doing a disservice to everyone who slaps something together. But slapping together an FPS in the Unity engine, which makes it very easy to make a unique and cool FPS game for relatively little investment. So I agree with everything in the video, but I think it does gloss over some of the points of why nobody's investing in it. Is it entirely because of the lack of monetization, or is it just because no one can find anyone willing to address those points, or at least take a risk? Because it is a significant risk to make a comprehensive RTS engine and editor and then say, well, we hope people will pay money in some way for this, because it's not a charity, unlike, well, what we're doing for Gamers Forgiven. But so, yeah, bittersweet video, I will say. RTS, as it was, very, very suited to the bring a game home in a box, and then once you play through that, play with your friends in different ways. So I don't know where I land on it. I don't know if that's why the next RTS will fail. Maybe I'm underestimating that demographic and like the amount of people that, when given the right, I guess, canvas in this case, will come back to the genre. There's always talk about coming back to RTS. I'm a little skeptical of that, but I do agree that competitive multiplayer is not it. Like, worrying about the newest esports title is not it. And really never has been. So, it's a great video. It touches on a lot of very important points, and I agree with all of them. But I don't necessarily think... I guess I'm being a little too cynical. Just because no one's done it doesn't mean they can't. Gaming has changed a lot since StarCraft 2 came out. I don't know, like Frost Giant, Sunspear, Dreamhaven. There are companies putting things out there with the people who made these games, and I think very much. I guarantee you they'll watch this. They probably already watched this, and they probably already agree, because they were listening to people like Grant and myself say that to their faces for many years. I feel like I'm kind of going in circles now, but yeah, I'm gonna look at what Twitch chat's saying and see if there's anything I missed. What do you guys think? Twitch chat. Anything you think I didn't expand on from my perspective? Nothing good? Just keep patting yourself on the back. I can do that. One of the original SC2 devs is a streamer on Twitch. He said a single WoW horse armor skin made more money than SC2 did at launch. I mean, that probably depends on a whole lot of things. It might be true if you consider the amount they paid to develop SC2 compared to the amount they made, but I seriously doubt the net revenue is higher, considering that StarCraft 2 is one of the best-selling PC games of all time. Cutscenes. Not that everybody loves the cutscenes SC2. I don't think they need to be cutting-edge, bleeding-edge quality, as long as you have a good, fun cutscene. Watching Alternity's players appear far less aggressive and gameplay seems slower. Was it players or Blizzard that pushed for faster, shorter games? Well, as time goes on, players got better and better. Which means, one, in Legacy of the Void, the game got a lot faster. You start with 12 workers, so everything starts faster. You get more units more quickly. And that was, most people agreed, a good thing, because the build-up time was essentially just the build-up time. Like, why waste all this? I think from the multiplayer perspective, the reason it feels so hardcore is not necessarily the speed at which things start, but at which they can go wrong. They focus so much on not looking away for 1 second, and that ending your game, I think, is a big issue with multiplayer. But as we talked about, as Grant talks about, multiplayer is a small percentage of the people interested or playing the game as well. I think it could be a larger percentage if there was any more incentive, but potentially losing MMR. But right now, and historically, there hasn't been. So I don't think it's necessarily the design of the game itself, but also partially the lack of any sort of long-term incentive to get better, except for being that hardcore player. And that is part of why players have always tended towards co-op, towards user-generated content, stuff like that, because at least it's fun. Like, on a scale of campy to predictable to deep and innovative, how do you like your campaign story? It depends on how much I'm able to play it. Like, I don't mind the SC2 story being pretty campy, because a lot of the campy parts are just the highlight, and the rest of the time you're playing the missions, which has some dialogue over. Some games really hold your hand with the story and spell everything out. I think Halo Infinite was a glaring example of expecting the player to literally be a 7-year-old speaking English for the first time with how much it sat there and spelled everything out for you. Like, that really takes me out of the fact I'm playing a game. I think just having with RTS games, you want to have a broad background. I think not necessarily having like a super compelling story is necessary if you set the scene. If you set the what is it called? The environment, the world, essentially. You've created, in this case, a galaxy, but you get the idea. You've done world building. And StarCraft did a lot of world building, which allows user-generated content to work off that. Like, it both inspires the stuff in the editor and stuff to work off of, and potentially split off storylines, custom campaigns, etc., etc. It isn't necessarily like the most compelling story ever, but it does a ton of world building between the Terran, the Zerg, and the Protoss, all the different factions, all of that people are invested in. So, but yeah, so my concerns with the next RTS are, how do you appeal to a modern audience? How do you justify a live support game in the 2020s, essentially? And how do you do that without having a significantly lower amount of profit margin than, I don't know, say releasing a World of Warcraft horse armor or a new Apex Legends skin or something? I don't think anyone's answered that question yet. That doesn't mean it doesn't have an answer. And this is not even talking about multiplayer or anything like that, so we'll see. But thank you to Grant for shining a light on this and doing it eloquently, and I'm glad he didn't bring up these points. I want to be clear. I don't think every single discussion about this has to talk about profit margin. I'm just a cynical bastard, so I'm going to do that. But and I've been dealing with the nobody plays this game anymore kind of memes literally for a decade, even though statistically more people play it now than played probably a decade ago. I'm glad he focused on what people want to play, because then you work around that. If people are playing, you can maybe find a way to monetize it, and that's what's important. So thank you to Grant for making that video. I agree with everything he said. I hope I provided some additional context and food for thought. And I look forward, cautiously optimistic about the future of RTS. Thank you for watching. Good luck. Have fun. Stay chill.